All right, today we're diving into a pretty provocative idea. What if one of Christianity's most central beliefs, the Trinity, wasn't actually part of the original faith preached by the apostles? We're going to walk through a source that makes a really compelling case for just that. So let's unpack the evidence and see where it takes us.
I mean, just think about it. If you were a Christian in the first century, would the idea of one God in three co-equal persons even be on your radar? That's the core question this source is forcing us to ask. And it's a big one, because it challenges us to dig into the history, the scriptures, and the very nature of belief itself.
And, this isn't just some abstract theological puzzle. The source argues it's about the very real weight that gets placed on a believer's conscience. This quote right here gets straight to the heart of the matter. The harm that happens when a complex, human-developed idea becomes a non-negotiable pass-fail test for your faith.
So, how does the source even begin to build this case? Well, it all hinges on a single, really powerful claim. It's not about whether the Trinity is true or false, but about how we classify our beliefs in the first place. Okay, so here's the argument in a nutshell. The Trinity isn't a dogma, which is a non-negotiable truth revealed directly by God and the apostles. Instead, it's what's called a theologian, a fancy word for a theological opinion, something crafted by humans to explain that truth. The source argues that this distinction, this alleged misclassification, is the key to understanding this whole thing. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to get on the author's wavelength. What exactly is the difference between a divine truth and a human opinion? The source gives us some very clear and very strict definitions.
And you can see the contrast right here. On one side, you've got dogma. It's a revealed truth handed down directly from the apostles, something the church can only receive. But on the other side, you have theologomenon. That's a human-made theory, something constructed to explain God, which means, it could be wrong. One is presented as divine, the other as fundamentally human.
This quote right here is basically the source's litmus test for any true dogma. It has to be received, not invented. The church's job, in this view, is to be a guardian, not an architect. Now, that sets an incredibly high bar, and it's the standard the source is now going to use to measure the doctrine of the Trinity.
So, with that really strict definition in mind, the source turns to the Bible. Does the doctrine of the Trinity, as we know it today, actually meet this high standard of direct apostolic revelation? The source points to these verses right here as the apostles' clearest, most foundational statements about who God is, and you see the pattern. In every single one, the Father is unambiguously called the one God. And the argument is that this is the apostolic bedrock of Christian monotheism.
So, what about Jesus? Well, the source argues that in these very same passages, he's not described as another person within a three-person Godhead. No, instead, he has these incredibly exalted titles: Lord, Messiah, Mediator. He's the supreme agent sent by the one God, the Father. It's a subtle distinction, but according to the source, it's an absolutely crucial one.
Now, to understand this, we kind of have to put on our first-century Jewish thinking caps. They had this concept of the Logos, or the Word, a powerful divine being who acted as the agent of creation, but who ultimately came from and was subordinate to the one supreme God. The source argues that is the mental framework the apostles were using, not the later Greek philosophy that would shape the Nicene Creed.
Okay, so if the apostles didn't teach the Trinity as we know it, where did it come from? The source argues that it wasn't revealed all at once, but was actually constructed over time. Let's take a look at the historical evidence that's presented.
This timeline really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, look at that gap. You've got nearly 300 years between the death of the last apostles and the famous Council of Nicaea. The argument is that in all that time, the doctrine wasn't just clarified, it was actively built, piece by piece, to answer questions the apostles themselves never even asked.
So what happened during those 300 years? Well, as debates about Jesus' exact nature got more and more intense, church leaders turned to a brand new toolbox: Greek philosophy. They started using technical terms and concepts that, the source argues, would have been completely alien to the original Jewish writers of the New Testament. And here they are, the building blocks of the famous Nicene Creed. Words like ousia, meaning essence, hypostasis, a really technical term for person, and the most controversial one of all, homoousios, meaning of the same essence. These words have defined Orthodox Christianity for centuries, and yet, as the source points out, not a single one of them is found anywhere in the Bible. And then there's another layer to this whole story: politics. The Council of Nicaea wasn't just a theological summit, it was a political one, called by the Roman Emperor Constantine himself.
He wanted a unified empire, and a messy, divided church was a huge threat to that unity. The source suggests that this imperial pressure for a single, binding creed played a major role in how things turned out.
So if the Trinity was a later construction, something influenced by philosophy and politics, what does that mean for believers today? The source argues it means a release of the conscience. Let's see what that actually looks like.
The author brings us back to the absolute basics. What did the apostles actually say you needed to do to be saved? Citing passages like Romans 10:9, the argument is that the original gospel requirement was startlingly simple. Confess that Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead. That's it. Full stop.
This slide really puts the two paths in stark contrast. On the left, you've got the simple confession of faith taught by the apostles. On the right, you have the complex philosophical and theological machinery of the 4th century. The source's pointed question is, when and why did the path on the right become a mandatory requirement for salvation?
And this is where the source makes its boldest claim. It says that by elevating the Nicene formula to a dogma required for salvation, the Church did the very thing the Apostle Paul warned against. It added a human tradition to the divine gospel, creating a burden the original faith never intended for people to carry.
And so we're left with this fundamental question, one that really cuts to the core of the entire issue. Where does God's word end, and where does our sincere but still fallible human tradition begin? The source doesn't give us an easy answer, but it definitely challenges us to look at the foundations of our own faith and ask, what do we truly believe and why do we believe it?